Hi, am I audible? Hi, am I audible? Is the screen visible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Huh?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you so much. Uh, I'm Geetika Agarwal. I am a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences in IISc Bangalore, and I will be your second PMRFTA for this course, I Think Biology, offered by Azim Premji University. And today is my first tutorial session. Yesterday was the other TA Arpit's session. And so, welcome to today's session. And so let's keep this an interactive session so that you guys can. So basically, you can type out your doubts in the chat box, or you can unmute at any point and ask me whatever doubts you might have, either from this week's lectures or from yesterday's tutorial if you were there. And I will basically summarize what happened in this week's lectures, and then we'll move on to some Q&A, and that will be it for today's tutorial. Okay. So, moving on to what happened in this week. First of all, we discussed what is biology, or like what do you define as biology. So, would you guys like to try? What comes to your mind when you think of biology? Does not need to be a scientific definition. You just can tell me whatever comes to your brain when you think of biology. Anyone would like to try and venture what they think is biology? Okay, so if not, so when most people were asked, so the professors for this course, they basically conducted a little bit of a survey and they asked students or in general people what they thought biology was. And when they were questioned, they gave a few interesting answers, such as biology is the study of living organisms. And they moved on to saying biology is what is connected with medicine and healthcare. So when they think of medicine, biology comes to their brain. They think of biology and diagrams, and drawing these diagrams in school comes to their minds. They think about genetics, about DNA, about evolution. Or they think about, in general, plants, animals, and interactions that happen between these organisms and between these organisms and their environment. So, one thing that you notice is common in all of these links is that biology is something to do with living organisms. So the first definition is more or less what suffices, is that it is the study of living organisms. We're trying to know how living organisms function and how everything connected to them works around them and what happens. So this brings us to the next question of how do we define a living organism? What is a living organism? So, uh, would you guys like to try and talk about some characteristics of living organisms? So, what do you think is important for something to have for it to be characterized as living? Would you guys like to take a guess? Anyone?
Ma'am, movement.
Okay, yes, living organisms can move. That is a very important point. Movement. But so one exception to this would be some plants. Plants cannot move around. So this could not be like the only definition that describes a living organism. So what other characteristics can be there? Because when you think of movement, you can think of all these vehicles, trains, cars. They can also move around. So, but that does not suffice us defining a living organism. So what other things can be there that are important for something to have for it to be living? Nobody? Okay. So certain other characteristics that they talked about for that characterize a living organism could be food or fuel. That we all need to eat something. We all need to have fuel of some sort in order to sustain. For example, we humans or animals, we are heterotrophs. We eat other living organisms. For example, could be fruits and vegetables, or could be other organisms such as animals themselves. For example, we all eat chicken or eggs or things like that. Then plants also produce their own fuel. They do it by because they're autotrophs. They do it by photosynthesizing. They utilize carbon dioxide and um, water vapor, and they use sunlight, and then they produce their food. So we all require one second. Yeah, they all require fuel of some sort. But again, a lot of other things also require food. For example, vehicular machinery. Those things also require fuel. A lot of these machineries, which are powered by either electricity or by fossil fuels like petrol, all of them also require food. So this could not be it. There should be something else. Then we talk about reproduction. It could be a very important characteristic defining living organisms, that we all reproduce. We all, in some manner or the other, give rise to other living organisms. We produce other living beings. But there are certain living organisms that do not reproduce. For example, worker bees or ants in their colonies, not all of them reproduce. They only have a queen bee. They have the queen in the ant colony, which reproduces, in the termite colony also. And they themselves just take care of the larvae. So are they not living? But we know that they are. And they are very much living in all of their other characteristics. So another thing to define living organisms could be excretion or waste production. So we all, everything that consumes fuel or that consumes food will definitely produce some excreta, some type of waste. So for example, all of us produce feces, and all animals produce feces, and plants in that matter, they give out oxygen as a byproduct of their metabolism, which is actually good for all of us. So there is something or the other that is produced as a waste. And then there is growth. One thing is growth that characterizes all of the living organisms. Most of us, we grow. Animals grow, plants grow. So growth is one important characteristic of a living organism. So these five are more or less some characteristics that define a living organism, but they alone or something alone cannot still define what is living and what is not. It is not a trivial task to define what is a living organism. Because even after having all of these definitions, if we move on and we try and answer some of the questions, for example, is a seed living? Do you think if a seed is living or not? For example, because once it's out of the, once it's not in the soil, it's in your hand, it's not living. You could say that it's not living because it's not reproducing, nothing is happening, it's just lying there. For example, all of these nuts that we are consuming, or all of these pulses, you don't think that they are living. But once you put them in water, or once you put them in the sand and they sprout and they become a plant, then they become living. So what is this characteristic? It cannot just, you cannot just say something is non-living and then suddenly something is living. But that is what happens. So a seed would have like the potential for life. It can become into a plant if it sprouts, but till then it is in between a state which is Is it living or is it non-living? We don't know. Then are the fruits and vegetables that we're consuming, are they living or they're non-living? We all think that they're non-living, and that is why we're eating them in the first place. If they were living, that would be like killing something, like all the that would be like eating non-vegetarian things. But fruits and plants are thought of as, like when they're plucked from the plant, they're thought of as being not living, but that is not the case. For example, you can again put some of these back into the soil and they'll sprout into another plant. So you cannot say that they're living or they're non-living. So is having the potential for life equivalent to being living? So these are some questions that I would like you to think about, and then you can decide how do you want to demarcate living from non-living. So that is why I would like to mention that it is not a very trivial task to define what is living, because there are so many characteristics that can be used to recognize living beings. But all of them are not foolproof. There are so many exceptions to all of this. As we know, biology is a science of exceptions. So we need to think properly before we come to a conclusion of whether something is living or not living. It's a fluid definition, and we must always look at more than one proofs for the presence or absence of life. Okay, so moving on to what is science itself. So, can you guys tell me what is science? What do you think of as science? What is science to you? Anybody who would like to venture? What do you think is science, or what comes to your brain when you think about science? Anyone?
To study about
To study about?
environment, our living beings.
Yeah, to study about environment and living beings. That is one way to put it. But in general, we're talking about science. We're not just talking about biology right now. So, how or what do you think comprises science? What are like what comes to your brain? This is correct, to study about the environment and to study about living organisms. Anybody else? Okay, so when we think about science, it is basically a practice, or it's a particular way of thinking or understanding about the world. So scientists, they use this practice called science, or not just scientists, all of us, even students of science, we have this particular way of thinking in which we want to understand the world. And it basically involves a lot of these things like observation. First thing that scientists or anybody involved with science tries to do is observe. So if you are somebody who's interested in life in biology, you would mostly observe the plants, the animals around you, the life around you, so that you, and if you see something interesting, you would want to ask a lot of questions about that how is this happening, what is going on. So observation is one of the key um, things that we do in science. If it comes to other scientists, for example, physicists or chemists, you could say physicists would see how is something moving, how is sound propagating, how is light propagating. They have all of these questions in their domain. And if it comes to chemistry, you would see how are certain reactions happening, how is certain compound becoming into something else. So all of these observations is the starting point of science. That is where science starts from. So the day you start observing your environments, you are doing science in some way or another. Next is exploration. You want to explore, you want to know more about how something is happening. So you might all have seen ants walking in a straight line somewhere or the other. You would have come across that. And then you would have thought, maybe as a kid or maybe as an adult, whenever you observe that, then why are these ants following each other? Why are they walking around in a line? What is making that do? So that brings up the curiosity, the scientific curiosity and the exploration. You would want to try that, okay, fine, I'll try and put some of these ants a little away from the other ones, and will they still go back to that line? So that is the exploration part of science. And you're trying to seek the reality or the truth. what is actually happening, what is going on, and not something that is just not like a basic explanation to it. You would want to know the truth. So in science, you really want to know what is the reality, what is the truth, what can be tested and proved that, okay, yes, this is the truth of the situation. And then you would conduct experiments to reach that reality, to reach that truth. You would conduct a series of experiments in order to prove what is um what is the case, what is actually going on. So in case of ants following each other, you would want to know how are they following each other. So you can basically place some ants isolatedly, and you can see how they follow or how they move. And they might not be following a line, but when you place them one behind the other, they follow a line. And that is when you can think of other things. How is that happening? How are they communicating? Are they communicating? Is something going on between these ants in which they know how to go into the same direction? So that is where experimentation kicks in. And then there are predictions. You come up with certain hypotheses or certain ideas that, okay, I think this is what is going on. I think they might be in some pheromones or some scents involved, which other ants pick up on, and that is why they're following the ones ahead of them. So that is a prediction that you come up with. And then based on these predictions, you would like to test them, and then you would come up with the explanation of what you observed. So basically, all of these are the steps that are involved in science. So you observe something, you want to explore it further, you want to know what is going on, and then you perform certain experiments, you come up with certain predictions, and then you give some explanations for the phenomena that you have just observed. So this is all that is involved in the process of science. And if you want to define science, there are many ways. It could be thought of as an activity, could be thought of as a practice that scientists engage in. So, science can be something, okay, if somebody asks you what is science, so whatever scientists do is science. So, it can be thought of as a activity. It can be thought of as a body of knowledge. So, all of the knowledge that is being generated by humans, that comes under science. So, it could be thought of as a body of knowledge. Or it could be thought of as a systematic venture in which we are attempting to organize knowledge into testable predictions and into explanations about the workings of the universe. So, we are trying to know how the universe is working, and all of this knowledge, we're trying to organize it into predictions and explanations. So, all of the above are basically what is science. It can be thought of as a practice, can be thought of as a body of knowledge, can be thought of as this attempt of organizing knowledge. So, how do you say something is science and something is not science? So, do you think that there are certain characteristics that distinguish scientific thinking from non scientific thinking? Can you think of certain characteristics of science that distinguishes it from other thoughts that are pseudoscience or not really science?
Logical reasoning.
Yeah, logical reasoning can be one of them. So basically, being rational and not really just accounting certain behavior or certain phenomena to just, some magical or destiny or things like that that cannot be proved. So, yeah, logical thinking. Anything else?
uh, Analyzing and observing.
Yeah. So, analyzing and observing, that are really correct. So if you think about science, some things that separate it from other things are that science is first of all testable. So whatever, if you're saying something as a part of science, it needs to be testable. There should be some way of testing the truth of it, whether it is actually um, happening or not happening. There should be some way of testing that. If something is not testable, if you, for example, in religion, a lot of the things are associated with divine power, but as long as we cannot test the presence of that divine power, it cannot be thought of as science. So it has to be testable. There should be some way of testing out what is going on. It should be falsifiable. There should be certain ways in which you can falsify the statements that you're making. So it should not be something that does not have an alternate at all. So it cannot be something ki, okay, this has happened because of the presence of God, but you cannot falsify that at all, because anything you say can be because of presence of God. There is no way of falsifying that statement. So, what you say under science should be strictly falsifiable. There should be ways of proving it wrong, and it should be generalizable. You can apply it to, so mostly in science we try and uh, study a phenomena, and we try and generalize what is happening in the phenomena into other similar phenomena. So it should be generalizable in one way or the other. It should be reproducible. If I have done something and I have said that, okay, when I do this, this happens, then if somebody else is trying out a similar experiment, they should also be able to reproduce my results by using the same techniques that I have utilized. It should be quantifiable. So this is sort of in the middle. Science is not always quantifiable, but most of the time there should be some way of quantifying what you're saying in the domain of science, and it should be peer reviewed. So if I am coming up with something that is like a discovery or an explanation to a phenomena, it should be reviewed by my peers, by other scientists, and then only it can be accepted as a part of science. So it should be peer reviewed as well. Okay, so these are some things that happen in science but do not happen in other non-science uh, domains. So next brings us to what is the scientific process. So now that we've discussed what science is and how it happens and what are important parts in science, there is a scientific process that scientists like to follow. So first of all, what they do is making systematic observations and collecting data. So you go out and you observe something and you collect data about it, that okay, I observed that this and this is happening. So this can be either an unmanipulated natural system, or it can be a manipulated system. So an unmanipulated system means, like, if you are working in biology or in environment, you go out and you make your observations in the real world and not in a laboratory setup. And a manipulated natural system is, if you make that, you try to replicate that setup in the laboratory, and there you manipulate certain things, you tweak certain things. Oh, hello. Hello. Hi. Is my screen visible? Sorry, I lost my data connection for. Uh, there was a slight glitch. Hi, am I audible? Is the screen visible to all of you?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I was talking about the scientific process. So how do you go about how do you go around doing science? So what do you do? First of all, you make some systematic observations and you collect data on systems that can either be unmanipulated. For example, you go out in the field and you collect data from an unmanipulated system in which things are happening in the real time, or in manipulated system, for examples where you make up a replicate of the system in your lab, and then you tweak certain conditions here and there, you manipulate it a little bit, and then you test it out. For example, you could be looking at the effect of temperature on say how plants grow. So you could be looking at that. So you can be looking at the effect of temperature more or less in the wild. For example, you move from one place to another. One place, one is downhill, one is uphill. The uphill one will have a little lower temperature, and you look at how different are the plants growing in those areas. Another way of doing it is to actually bring that plant into the lab and you expose it to different temperature conditions. That would be a manipulated natural system. So you basically start out by making some systematic observations. Then you examine this data for some patterns. If you see any patterns in the data, that okay, whenever I'm reducing temperature, the plants are becoming shorter in height. So that could be a pattern that you're observing. So you examine your data for patterns and you find some logical explanations for these patterns. Then, based on these explanations that come to you, you produce some hypotheses, some theories that you think might be uh, useful to explain what is going on in your system. And then these theories have to be falsifiable, as I said. Whatever hypotheses or predictions you make, they have to be falsifiable. There should be a way of proving them wrong. Then you test these predictions based on your experiments, you test them, and then you can either these can get falsified and then you'll have to make new predictions and go back to your observations, or these can be supported and then you just retest them and see that okay, these are correct still, and then they become a fact that okay, yes, this is true, whatever I have proposed. So this is how science or how scientific process works. Okay, am I clear? Does anybody have any doubts in this? Okay, so then we discussed some pillars of biology. What are some important features of biology? In this, first of all, we talked about genetics, and so you all might know, and you can see in this image, there's a cell. All of these cells are comprised of chromosomes, and these chromosomes are basically made up of DNA, and a particular specific DNA sequence is called a gene. So, genetics is the study of how these genes and how these traits are passed down from one generation to the next. So, that is genetics. And we look at inheritance of these genes from one generation to the other in as a part of genetics. And another pillar of biology is very closely related to genetics is evolution. So, which can also be understood as a process in which there is a change in gene composition of a population over time. So if there is one starting population, there when we look at changes in the genetic composition of the population over generations, over time, then that is evolution. And these evolutionary changes must be inherited from one generation to next. So till a change is or a trait is not herited from one generation to the next, it's not called evolutionary change. Okay. And an example of evolution comes, some of you might already be aware of the Darwin's finches. So basically, Charles Darwin went on a voyage and he reached the Galapagos Islands. There he came across these similar birds, but which were still different from each other. And these were called Darwin's finches. He looked at these birds and they all had different beak features and they were consuming different diets. So he tried to explain this by saying that if there was one starting population which would have come from the mainland and would have come to the island, it could have then separated into these different species which could use these different resources that are available in the island. For example, some of them specialized on eating seeds, and that is why they have these bigger beaks which can break down these seeds. And then some of them moved on to eat insects which have these slender bills. Others are feeding on leaves, some of them feeding on grubs. So that is how their beaks got slightly modified from each other. So this is the changes that happened from that starting population that populated the island, and then eventually in further populations they started becoming different from each other and adaptively eating or specializing on a certain kind of diet. So that is a form of evolution, which is also called adaptive radiation. And evolution, as you might know, comes along by the process called natural selection, in which certain traits get selected over others based on what makes the animal or the organism more fit for their environment, better adapted in their environment. So that is what is evolution and how it happens. Okay. And next, we talked about the tree of life and how all of the organisms are classified into three different categories: bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes. And we follow in these category called eukaryotes, which includes plants, it includes fungi, it includes animals. So these are where we fall in the animals category. And all of these three categories, they all arise from one single common ancestor, which is called the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. So this is how the tree of life looks like. And from here, we moved on to discussing how living things have two things in common. One is that all of them are made up of cells, which will lead us to discuss the cell theory. So, all of the living organisms are made up of cells. They can either be unicellular organisms, for example, bacteria, or they can be multicellular organisms, for example, plants and animals, and all of us. And another thing is that all of the living things, they have DNA as their genetic material, except from some viruses which still use RNA, which is like archaic genetic material. But all of us have DNA as our genetic material. So that is, these are two basic things that all living organisms share with each other. Okay, so this brings us to some important points to keep in mind. First of all, since all of us or all of the living organisms share DNA, DNA can be thought of as an instruction manual that tells the cells what to do. So in DNA, we have these nucleotide bases: ATGC, adenosine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. All of them are present in certain specific sequences, and then they are interpreted into certain instructions. So that is how DNA can be thought of as an instruction manual that is present in all of the cells, and it tells the cell what to do. All of the living organisms, they share the same language, the language of the DNA. And this is what makes it possible for scientists to use genetic engineering, so and develop genetically modified organisms. Since all of us, all of the humans and animals and plants and bacteria, we all have DNA in us. So we can tweak certain things here and there and make genetically modified organisms. And that is how genetic engineering works, since we have the same language. If we had different ways in which we will be working, if we all did not have the same, like, uh, DNA to instruct ourselves, then this could not have been possible. But all of us having the same instruction manual or having the same language makes it possible to develop genetically modified organisms. For example, better species of plants, or these different breeds of dogs. All of these things happens because of the same DNA. And one important thing to keep in mind is that all the cells belonging to the same individual share the same DNA, even though they might not be doing same things in the body. For example, think of you and me. Every single cell that constitutes your body contains the same DNA. Even though it might be a part of the brain, there might be a cell which is part of the tongue, a cell which is part of a muscle, cell which is part of the liver. All of these are doing entirely different tasks in your body, but they all have the same DNA. Only that in them, different genes in that DNA are activated, which makes them do these different tasks. So basically, cells in our body have compartmentalized their tasks. So every cell knows what to do. Think of a class of 100 students, all of them know what to do, but when it is, say, the sports meet, you all of you know how to imagine such a class in which all of you know how to dance, all of you know how to sing, all of you know how to run, how to play volleyball, play basketball. But then you compartmentalize these tasks, and only certain of you take participate in some of these things. So that is how cells work. All of the cells know how to be a neuron, how to be a gland, how to be an intestinal cell, a gut cell, but they activate certain things in them and deactivate the other ones, and then do their specific tasks in the body. So that is another thing to keep in mind, because it plays an important role while looking at generating organs in the lab. This brings us to cell theory. So in cell theory, there are these three things. All living organisms are composed of cells. So all of the living organisms in the world are composed of cells. They could be unicellular, they could be multicellular, but they're all composed of cells. And cell is the basic unit of life. It's the basic structural and the basic functional unit of life. So the smallest unit, or the most basic unit of life, is cell. And all of these cells arise from pre-existing cells. So there is, none of the cells can just come from nowhere. All of these cells have to arise from certain pre-existing cells. And this brings us to a very important question from the tree of life, that then where did Luca come from? Where is the last universal common ancestor? Where did that come from? If life cannot just arise from, nothingness. If cells have to arise from pre-existing cells, how did Luca happen? So this is a very big domain of research. It involves study of the origin of life. It involves how the abiotic transitioned into the biotic, and how this happened via the assembly of or self assembly of certain abiotic factors. So this brings us to the end of the first lecture. And to keep in mind that not everything is evolution. Whatever So evolution, as we discussed, is happens only when certain characteristics get passed on from one generation to the next. So not everything can be counted as evolution. So here is a list of three things. So can you guys tell me which of the following are not evolutionary changes? Oh, sorry, I missed your message. Can you explain more about archaea? Yes, I can. So when you talk about archaea, they are a type of cells which are very ancient, they're very old, and they are found in very extreme climates or very extreme habitats. For example, they can be found inside at very high temperatures, or at very, very low temperatures, at very high pressures. For example, the cells that are found at the ocean base, at the seabed, those some of them fall in the category of archaea because they are under immense uh, pressure and at a very low temperature because the seafloor is very cold. And things where you imagine that there would be no life, for example on the mountain tops in the ice, or for example in volcanoes, even there certain cells are present, and those cells are actually archaea, and they are um, genetically very different from other cells, from like bacteria or eukaryotes, and that is why they are in a separate category, which is archaea. Okay. Yeah, so that was like the basic of it. You can read more about it. And coming to my question, so which of these followings are not really evolutionary changes? So we have these three statements. One of them is bees learning how to find high amounts of nectar in yellow flowers, a plant that is prone to make a bonsai, and a squid which is camouflaging against its surroundings. So which ones of these do you think are not evolutionary changes, and which of these are evolutionary changes? Would you guys like to take a Would you guys like to take a guess or try to answer this? Yeah, so plant that is pruned to make a bonsai is actually not something that is evolution, because that plant would in general have become a big tree. But since the gardener is actually pruning it to make it into a bonsai, so even if you look at the seeds of the plant, or the progeny of the plant, that will become a normal tree. It will not become a bonsai. So that is not an evolution. What about a squid which is camouflaging against its surroundings? Is it something that it gets during its lifetime, or is that through evolution? Yeah. So a squid that is camouflaging against its surroundings is evolution. It's something that has evolved in the squid. So not they do not learn it from their parents. They basically have that innate ability. They have it since birth. That ability of camouflaging with their surroundings. What about bees learning to find high amounts of nectar in yellow flowers? Is that something which is evolution, or is that something that is learned within its lifetime? Yes, it's evolution. Yeah, so bees, over the time or over generations, they would have say maybe the bees in the previous generations would have gone up to yellow flowers and found that okay, these flowers have a lot of nectar, and these bees got or they got naturally selected over other ones which were not approaching yellow flowers. So this could be um, this could be actually both ways. If you think of it, within one generation also you can make bees learn to go for yellow flowers because they get high amounts of nectar in them. Or it could be evolutionarily they approach yellow flowers only compared to other flowers. So it can come in both categories actually. Okay. Moving on to looking at cities through the lens of biology. So, this is what we discussed in the third lecture of this week. We were looking at cities through the lens of biology. And so, brings us to the question, why cities? Why should we look at cities in the first place? That is because, first of all, cities are places which have a dense population of biotic components, majorly involving us humans, and which interact with each other. So, in cities, all of the humans interact with each other and they interact with the abiotic environment. So, this sort of makes the cities qualify for ecosystems. Ecosystems also do the same thing. In ecosystems, you call something an ecosystem where biotic and abiotic components are interacting with each other and the biotic components are interacting within themselves. So cities, they qualify as ecosystems, so we can study them as ecosystems. And it is important to look at cities because a major chunk of the human population, around 50%, is already living in this man-made landscapes. So it's important to look at cities. And you can look at this satellite image of India, which was taken at night in 2012. So here you can see that with the amount of artificial light that there is in the cities, you can actually make out the entire boundary of our country. And there are these major cities: Mumbai, Bangalore, Kolkata. You can see them becoming bright specks in the night sky. And in India, there has been a major shift of lifestyle for humans. In general, a lot of us have been shifting to move to bigger cities. And now people most often have their first contact with nature in urban landscapes. We don't really, not all, a lot of us are entirely brought up in the cities. So our first and most often contact with the nature happens in these urban landscapes in the form of gardens, parks, lakes, things around our homes. So it's important to look at cities, and it's important to plan cities in a way that fosters a deep connection between humans and nature. So we need to ecologists and urban ecologists need to work in such a manner so that you can build a connection between humans and the nature around them. So coming to looking at city as an organism, one way of looking at cities through the lens of biology is to consider them as an organism. How does that happen? So, there is this term called urban metabolism, and it is used to describe how a city can behave as a living, breathing organism. And in urban metabolism, people or the urban ecologists, they usually map what is being input into the city and what is the output. Like we discussed, every living organism has some fuel and has some excretion. So we're looking at what are the inputs and what are the outputs. And one way of looking at them is, for example, the inputs in a city coming are the food that all of the biotech components consume, coal, petroleum, biomass, which is used to run our industries, our factories, our vehicles. That's the energy. And there are a lot of these goods coming into the cities. For example, construction material to build roads, to build the buildings, everything like that. So those are the inputs into the city. And when you look at the outputs from these food that we are consuming, we have these organic wastes, which we mostly resort to either landfilling of these organic wastes or we dump them into the seas and rivers around us. Then there are these emissions from these fuels in the form of gases, for example, carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, all of these. And then from these goods that we consume, there are inorganic wastes that go into landfill. For example, a lot of these plastic wastes that we produce. So there's kind of like a linear metabolism. Cities, they are consuming a lot of these raw materials, and then they are polluting also at a very high rate. So, what ecologists are trying to do is to convert these linear metabolic pathways into circular pathways so that cities become more sustainable. For example, these organic wastes, they can be fed back into the city in the form of compost, in the form of fertilizers, to grow more food for the humans living in the city. And these emissions can be reduced or they can also be cycled back to produce some other form of energy. So these are certain things that ecologists are trying to do in order to make cities more self-sustainable. making into a um, less waste producing entity. And another way of looking at city is to look at city as an ecosystem. So we just discussed that city is a place where a lot of these biotic components come around, interact with each other, and they also interact with the abiotic components around them, like the environment. And so, how do you look at city as an ecosystem? As I said, abiotic and biotic components. There are abiotic components, for example, temperature, rain, wind, there is light, there is soil, there is sound, there are these built up areas, and there's a certain topography of the city with which all of us are interacting in some way or the other. And the biotic components involves producers, for example, all the plants around us, consumers, uh, for example, us humans, and other things like our pets, dogs, cats, and other birds, other animals around us, and decomposers, for example, fungi and soil bacteria, which decompose a lot of these organic wastes or a lot of these other things into back into soil nutrients. Then coming to socio-economic contexts in the city, cities have a very strong social and economic side to them. So these are complex interactions between the city government and the industry that's running in the city and the society in general in which people live, and decide how this ecosystem is developing, where we are going, how we're going to develop the city. Then you look at the energy flow, how energy is flowing through the city. So in cities, humans sort of make up the highest trophic level. The So you might be aware of trophic levels that are present in a food chain. For example, um, in a food chain, you have the most basic trophic level. For example, say grass, which is being fed upon by some insects, which is being fed upon by a frog, which is being eaten by a bird. So these are certain trophic levels in which bird is the top predator here. So in cities, humans form the top trophic level, and they're artificially sustaining a lot of these plants in their gardens. They're sustaining a lot of these birds and animals which might not have survived without the presence of humans and without them providing for them. And a lot of the energy resources other than sun are also available in the city's energy flow, including electricity, natural gas, and all of them which are dependent on fossil fuels mostly. And last thing is to look at nutrient cycling, how these nutrients are being cycled in the ecosystem of the city. So most of these nutrient cycles, for example, you would know about the carbon cycle, about the water cycle in the natural environments. A lot of these cycles are out of balance in cities because of human activity. So a lot of this sewage that is being produced as an output from the city, it flows directly into rivers and lakes, which leads to algal blooms and a lot of these fishes that are being killed. And these industrial and vehicular emissions, they affect the carbon and nitrogen cycle, which otherwise is more or less in sync in the natural environments. But in the cities, there's a lot of output which is not being which does not get cycled back as an input into the city. So this is how you can look at city as an ecosystem, by looking at these four different components: the abiotic and biotic part, the social economic context, energy flow, and nutrient cycling. Then you can look at city as a cancer, how cancers grow. Cities are also growing these days. So this is the city of Bengaluru. And earlier, just the gray part was the part that you can see in gray was the one that was built up part of the city. And there were a lot of these lakes and other things in the city, and a lot of green cover. Eventually, it goes on to yellow and then red. So now, so many parts around the city of Bangalore have been occupied by humans, and they have been constructed, built up. So, this is, in a way, you can say that the city is expanding like a tumor. So, these are three different ways of looking at cities from the lens of biology. And an important question to ask ourselves is that, should cities be only for humans? Because some people have this opinion that you can keep cities only solely for humans, and that would leave a lot of these other natural spaces which can be used by animals and wildlife, which can be used by non-human animals and wildlife. But cities should only be concentrated for humans. So do you think that is correct, that is a correct approach to cities? Or do you think we should make cities more sustainable, and we should try to include all of this wildlife and everything with us where we live? What is your opinion about this? Yeah, so I also agree with you that we should try and plan our cities in such a way so that they are safe places to live for all of us and not just for humans, where humans can sustain and prosper and everything else suffers at the cost of our living. Fine. Coming to an important thing of ecosystem services, there are a lot of these services that we get from the environment, that we get from the ecosystem around us, which we do not really, you know, which we do not really think about in our normal lives. We mostly take them for granted, all of these services that the ecosystem is doing for us. So, I would like to highlight some of these services that are important for humans to sustain and are mostly taken for granted. One of them is provisioning. We get a lot of our raw materials from nature. So, we obtain these goods from nature. For example, we get our food, vegetables, and other animals, we get fresh water, we get wood, we get a lot of these medicinal plants. A lot of these compounds come from the uh, environment, our ecosystem, the natural ecosystems. There's a lot of regulating happening. A lot of these services, for example, the climate being regulated, water getting purified, pollination happening, soil erosion being controlled by trees. A lot of these benefits we obtain from ecosystem, and if we actually take out ecosystem from the equation and try to do all of this by humans and by machines, it would be very costly and we would not be able to. For example, think of pollination. We have so many fields, we have so many crops growing, and most of them depend on pollination or on pollination by bees, pollination by other insects for the growth of these crops. And if we actually think about hiring so many humans to do this task for us, it would be so expensive and it would not be humanly possible to achieve this. So, we get a lot of these benefits from the ecosystem. We get a lot of cultural benefits. For example, we get tourism, recreation, spirituality. A lot of these benefits we get from the environment. We learn a lot of things from the environment. And finally, it is a habitat for all of us. It is habitat for all of these species, and it maintains genetic diversity. So ecological functions are they provide us so many things that we mostly take for granted, but we should consider them while thinking about planning cities and while thinking about uh, what we are doing for the nature versus what nature is doing for us. Okay, coming to the Western Ghats. So in the next lecture, we discussed about the Western Ghats and their importance. So Western Ghats is a mountain range which stretches around 1600 kilometers from Kerala in the south to Gujarat in the north. From all the way from Gujarat, it spans towards Kerala, and it covers Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu on the way. And it is one of the 10 hottest biodiversity hotspots with a very high degree of endemism. Endemism is a term used to describe areas where there's a lot of plants and animals that are very unique to that area and they're not found anywhere else in the world. They're only found in that particular area. So Western Ghats has a high degree of endemism and they impact a huge area around them in terms of resource distribution, in terms of weather patterns. So Western Ghats, they have a huge role to play in how monsoon rains are distributed over the entire Deccan Plateau of India. So they have a huge impact on the area around them. So one study that we looked at during these lectures was how wind farms in the Western Ghats are having some cascading impacts on the ecosystem across different trophic levels. So Maria Thakur and her team, they looked at how these windmills that have been set up in the Western Ghats for a long time now, for decades, how they are impacting the organisms around them, majorly birds and this lizard species called Sarada superba. So they're looking at how areas with and without wind farms are different from each other in terms of their bird population and in terms of their lizard populations. So this study is done by doing a space for time substitution. So basically, since now you cannot look at the same area which already has a windmill, you cannot go back to the time where there was no windmills. So you look at similar areas without any wind farms, and you study those areas against areas which already have wind farms developed of them. So you substitute space in place of time to look at how these what is the impact of wind farms on these areas. So what they found was in areas with wind turbines, the bird populations or the populations predatory bird abundance was much lower, and in areas with no wind turbines, these predatory birds were um, the population was 4 times higher in areas where there were no wind turbines. And this would be pretty intuitive since all of these wind turbines are high up in the air and they affect the wind patterns. That is how they affect the migratory patterns of the bird, and also birds cannot fly around in between them freely because they get hit by these wind turbines and impacted by them. So in areas with wind turbines, you have very low bird populations as compared to areas with no wind turbines. And when you look at what is the lizard densities, so you have high lizard densities in areas with wind turbines and low lizard densities in areas with no wind turbines. And since these birds are predating or are lizard predators, they feed on these lizards. That is why areas with lower bird populations have higher lizard populations, and areas with higher bird populations have lower lizard populations. And when you look at what is the frequency of attack of predatory attacks on these lizards, areas with high wind turbines or high number of wind turbines have low frequency of attacks, and areas with no wind turbines have a higher frequency of attacks. So this is how wind turbines have impacted the bird and lizard populations. Areas with wind turbines have lower populations of birds and high populations of lizards. Now, when you look at stress in lizards, so this is like an indirect effect of wind turbines on lizards. How are their stress levels in these two areas? So, lizards in areas with wind turbines, they have lower stress hormones than areas with no wind turbines. So, lizards in areas with high amount of wind turbines have uh, more stress than areas with no have lower stress than areas with no wind turbines, because in areas with no wind turbines they are being predated upon by birds, but in areas with wind turbines the amount of predation is much less, so their stress is also much less. But another thing they found was that in areas which have wind turbines, the body condition of the lizard has also gone down. And this had happened because in these areas, the number of lizards have increased, and which has led to a competition for resources in that area. Yeah. So in areas with wind turbines, since the number of lizards are more, the competition is also higher for food resources, and that is what leads to them having a lower body condition, and their dewlap, which you can see in this image, is so brilliantly colored. This is duller in lizards which are found in areas with wind turbines. And lizards in areas with no wind turbines have a higher body condition because their population or their numbers are kept in check by the bird predation on them. So these are the indirect effects of wind turbines on lizards. So in the next two lectures, we mostly looked at the contributions of Dr. Janaki Amal, who is the first Indian. She was a renowned botanist and she was a plant cytologist, and she has done a lot of work towards the sugarcane species of India. She crossbred the Indian species of sugarcane with the Southeast Asian species, and now the sugarcanes that we get in India are much sweeter than they were before. And earlier, India had to depend on importing sugarcane for the production of sugar and consumption. But now we are self sufficient when it comes to sugarcane because of the efforts of Dr. Janaki Amal. She was the director of the Central Botanical Laboratory in Lucknow. And she also played a very important role in the Save Silent Valley movement. So, in the Silent Valley in Kerala, they were trying to make a dam construction project. And a lot of these activists were against this project because this dam construction would have drowned or like would have flooded a lot of the part of the Silent Valley and have impacted a lot of the population of this area. And this is a very highly diverse area of Kerala. So because of her efforts, eventually this dam construction project was stopped and this area was finally made into a national park in 1984. So the next lecture was basically talking about Janaki Amal and her contributions towards botany. And after that, we looked at Dr. Yelapragada Subbarao, who is another Indian who has played a very important role in biology and has made a lot of discoveries towards medicine. And yeah, it is very aptly said that because of his works, now humans can live a longer life. So he made all of these discoveries as I've underlined here. So he developed the Fiske-Subbarao method, which is a method which is used to estimate the amount of inorganic phosphates in the blood filtrates. He discovered ATP, adenosine triphosphate. He isolated a lot of phosphorus compounds, which could have been these nucleotide bases of RNA, but he was not allowed to publish them. He isolated folic acid and also developed synthetic folic acid, which could be afforded by general public because um, the folic acid that you get from extracting from bacteria or from other organisms is very expensive and cannot be afforded by the general public. He developed anti-folic acid drugs, namely aminoterrin and methotrexate, and these are used now to treat cancer. They're used till now in chemotherapy. He discovered DEC, which is used to treat filariasis, and he also isolated aureomycin, which is a broad spectrum antibiotic drug which can be used against gram positive and gram negative bacteria. So Dr. Yalapragada had a lot of contributions towards medicine, and he has discovered the drugs to treat a lot of these things like cancers and filariasis and bacterial diseases. So this was all that was discussed during this week, and now I would move on to the question and answer section for this week, so that we discuss to recap what happened in this week. So the first question is, what is a hypothesis? So a hypothesis must be based on existing knowledge, or it should be simple and predictable, testable, falsifiable, or all of the above. So now you guys can answer these questions so
Option.
that hi, can you repeat that? You can type out your answers in the chat box. You guys are correct. The correct answer is all of the above. The hypothesis must be based on some existing knowledge of the system. It should be simple and predictable. And as I said, there should be some way of testing the hypothesis and some way of proving that it is wrong. So the correct answer is all of the above. What is evolution? What do you think is evolution? Is it some changes happening in one individual? Is it changes happening in a population within a generation? Are they changes in a population over generations, or is it just a study of inheritance? Yeah. So you're correct. The correct answer is changes in the population over several generations. So that is what is evolution. And there is another correct answer. It is also the study of inheritance. So like genetics and evolution are very closely related. So you also look at how traits are being inherited from the previous populations to the next ones. So study of inheritance is also evolution. So both of these answers. Moving on to, what is the difference between a question and a hypothesis in scientific inquiry? So, how do you differentiate between a question and a hypothesis? A question is an observation, and a hypothesis is the answer to that question. A question stems from an observation, and a hypothesis is an educated guess or a potential answer to that question. Question is an assumption, a hypothesis is the answer to that assumption. Or a question arises after testing, and a hypothesis summarizes the findings. So, what do you think is a question? What is a hypothesis when we talk about scientific inquiry? Yeah. So the correct answer is that a question stems from an observation and a hypothesis is an educated guess. So as I already discussed in scientific process, you first go out, you make an observation, you see something, you observe it, then you ask a question about how that phenomena might be happening, and you come up with some probable explanations for that phenomena, which are the hypotheses, which can then be tested. So you guys are correct. Moving on to, which of the following statements accurately describes Dr. Amal's contributions? So, more than one can be correct answers. So, did she investigate the cytogenetics of plants? Did she conduct research in marine biology? Was she studying the genetic makeup of crops, or did she publish works on biochemistry? A. Okay, she investigated the cytogenetics of plants. Anything else? So you're correct. It's A and C. She investigated the cytogenetics and she also studied the genetic makeups of crops because, as we discussed, she was the one to hybridize Indian sugarcane with the Southeast Asian sugarcane to produce a sweeter variety. Which of the following was one of Subbarao's notable contributions to medicine? Was it the discovery of the structure of DNA? Was it the development of polio vaccine? Advancement in chemotherapy drugs? Or introduction of anesthesia in surgery? Are you guys sure? I don't think it is A. Introduction of anesthesia in surgery. Okay. Any other guesses? There is one C, advancement in chemotherapy drugs. So the correct answer to this is the advancement of chemotherapy drugs. So as I discussed, he developed these anti-folic acid drugs, which are basically now used in chemotherapy for treating cancer. He did not introduce anesthesia in surgery or discover the structure of DNA. Okay, moving on to what is the first step in the scientific method? Where do you begin scientific method from or scientific inquiries from? Do you draw conclusions, form a hypothesis, ask a question, or conduct an experiment? So, what is the first step in scientific method? You are correct. So, the first step, as we discussed so many times now, the first step is basically asking a question. Which of the following, okay, this we have already answered. Which of the following best defines a control group in an experiment? So, what defines a control group in an experiment? When you're conducting an experiment, there's mostly a control group present. Is it the group where all the variables are changed, the group that receives the treatment that is being tested, the group that remains untreated for comparison, or the group with the largest sample size? So, what is the control group in an experiment? Okay. So B is not the correct answer. The group that receives the treatment is basically the treatment group that you're trying to test, but control group is the group that remains untreated with which you compare your group which you are giving a certain treatment to. So you're comparing these two groups, and the one that remains untreated or the one that remains untreated for a comparison is actually the control group. That is why it's called the control group. You control it for um, any any outside impacts. So you are totally, you do not do anything to that group. Okay, next question. Urban ecology studies the interaction between organisms and what? Deserts, cities, forests, and mountains. What is urban ecology? This is a very basic, simple question. Yeah, urban ecology basically is the study of interactions between organisms and cities. Which of the following is not a typical challenge for wildlife in urban areas? What is not a typical challenge that wildlife faces in urban areas? Habitat fragmentation, noise pollution, access to food, or light pollution? Okay, we have different answers here. Anybody else? So, the correct answer to this question is part C, which is easy access to food, because humans artificially provide food to a lot of these wildlife. For example, we put out food for birds, we put out food for dogs and cats in temples, put out food for cows. So a lot of these things, they have easy access to food, but they do face habitat fragmentation. They do not get a lot of natural cover to stay in. They do face noise pollution from the traffic and light pollution from our artificial lighting at night. So the correct answer is C. Green roofs and urban parks are examples of what? Are they examples of biodiversity losses, urban heat islands, sustainable urban design, or deforestation? Yeah, as the term might suggest, green roofs and urban parks, they are examples of sustainable urban design. How you can design a city while keeping a lot of these green areas and urban parks intact. Next question is, which of the molecule carries genetic information in most of the living organisms? So we've discussed this already. Is it RNA, DNA, proteins, or lipids? What carries genetic information in living organisms? Yeah, you guys are correct. DNA is what most commonly carries genetic information. The process by which organisms better adapted to the environment survive and reproduce is called what? So, what is the process by which organisms which are better adapted to their environment they survive and reproduce? Is it genetic drift, mutation, natural selection, or artificial selection? So, what is the process that uh, selects organisms better adapted to the environment? Yeah, so the correct answer is actually natural selection, because in natural selection, organisms that are better adapted, they get selected over the ones that are um, that are not so well adapted to the environment, because these ones which are adapted properly, they can reproduce more and they can leave behind more progeny, so their genes get propagated as compared to the ones, or selected over the ones that are not well adapted to that environment. So this was the end of the Q&A session. And coming to the useful links for this course, I have attached these two links. One of them is to my YouTube channel where all of these tutorials will be uploaded. And one is a link to the Google Drive folder where all of these presentations will be uploaded for your reference. So this was it for today. If anybody has any doubts, I am still here. You can ask me. You can either type it out in the chat box or you can unmute yourself. If you have no doubts, then we're done for the day. You can leave the meeting. Thank you for joining. No, tomorrow there is no class. There are only two tutorial sessions for this course. One of them happens on Friday, 6 to 8 p.m., and one is on Saturdays, 4 to 6 p.m. Yes, Muralidharan, go ahead. What is your doubt? Is which one the same class? Uh, are you talking about the tutorials on Friday and Saturday? So the tutorials on Friday are taken by another PhD student whose name is Arpit. And more or less, yes, we'll be discussing similar things. These basically are meant for problem solving. So any doubts that you guys have, and we mostly overview what happened during the week, and then we discuss doubts which students might have. So they are similar, but not the same class. So they would provide you the Google Drive link to this in the resources in NPTEL also. Uh, but you can also maybe take a screenshot right now and copy it from there. Yeah, you can attend any one of these sessions. You don't have to attend both of them. I actually don't know about the course progress percentage. We are not informed about that. I think you should ask this to the NPTEL team, to the uh, team concerned with grading this course. We are not aware about the course progress. We are only supposed to take these uh, problem solving sessions. You can ask this question in the in that FAQ sections in NPTEL, and maybe you'll get an answer to that. Okay, thank you. Any other doubts? Anybody else? If not, thank you for joining. This was all for today. Assignment types, mostly in this course, you'll only have Q&A, MCQ type questions. There will be quiz per week, and then you'll have to basically attempt those quizzes. And in the end, if you have signed up for the examination, you'll have to go and give that examination to get a certificate from NPTEL for having done this course. Other than that, mostly you'll only get these MCQ quizzes at the end of each week. Is that okay? This is a 12-week course, so I think you will have 12 weeks. This was only the first week. So there will be 12 assignments and then one final. How to send a scanned copy? Uh, which assignment are you talking about? Like the quiz that is present on the course page can just be submitted uh, there itself. You don't have to like submit a scanned copy of the assignment. 1 second. Okay, so 1 second, I will share my screen. So I think here you can see, so like this, there was a week 0, which was a practice assignment. So all of these assignments are mostly gonna be like these MCQ questions. You just have to answer them and submit the assignment here. So I don't think there is anything else that you require to do for the course. Uh, and Uzai, you can actually you can ask the questions here itself by typing them out in the chat box or by unmuting yourself. But if you have more doubts, you can also put them here in the Q&A section. So this is a Q&A section where you can ask questions which will get answered by your peers or by the other TAs of the course. Okay. Yeah. Any other doubts, anybody? Yeah, the class is over. Thank you. I'm just waiting here if anybody has any doubts to ask. If not, you can leave the meeting.